Very good morning to everybody just coming through on today's call. This month's masterclass, we're going to be looking at building workflows in the Moorepay HR system. Just whilst we're letting those last few people filter through, in today's session, we're going to be looking at four main areas of the system. When it comes to workflows, we're first of all going to be coming through and looking at all of the workflow options that are available. We're then going to be looking at the step types that can be used within workflows. We're then going to look at any restrictions that can be placed on those workflows. And then, as always, we're going to be going through some best practice hints, tips, and tricks that can help you when it comes to building workflows and when you're coming through to test those. I can see we've got a few more people just filtering through, so just remains me to introduce myself. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name's Liam Matthews. I'm one of the implementation consultants here at Natural HR. Today's session will be recorded, so if you do have any technical difficulties, find yourself having to drop off the call at any point, please don't worry, you will get a copy of this recording following the session. If you do have any questions at all during today's session, please feel free to pop them into the chat box, the questions box, and I will try and answer as many of those as I can during the call today. If there are any that are specific to a need, I'll get somebody to reach out to you directly on that instead. But without any further ado, let's get into today's session. And we're going to start off with looking at workflow types within the HR system. Now, our first type of workflow that we're going to look at, the first category that comes within, is going to be approval workflows. Now, these look at four key areas in the system. They look at requests people might make, changes that might be made against somebody's record. They can look all around the T&A area of the system, or they can look at areas such as recruitment and training. Now, some of these workflows we're looking at here, some of these types, they are already going to have some default processes that are in the system. There is more information on that in our knowledge base that will let you know some of the default processes. But what we can do is where we want to deviate from that, where we want to build our own processes, we can go through and do that for things like time off, expenses, when somebody's job might get changed, for when people might clock in, clock out, or submit timesheets. We can also do it where people might submit training requests, or where managers are entering their own vacancies. That can also go through an approval process. We'll be looking at some more examples of these later on in today's session. Our next type of workflow that we can begin to look at are our continuous workflows. Now, these are based off some key areas in the system. First and foremost, you may have come across continuous workflows that trigger based on a calendar date. Now, this can either be an absolute calendar date, i.e. we want this workflow to trigger on the 15th of every month, or it can be a relative date. It could be a workflow that you want to trigger on every Monday. It might be something that triggers on the third Friday of every month. You may also have workflows that you want to trigger around certain modules in the system. So if there is an expense claim that's over a certain threshold, or if there's a mileage claim that goes over a certain amount of miles, or if you're looking at time off where you've got things like time off duration, or as we can see an example in the screenshots here, where you've got 3 absences in the last 12 months, you can look at the time off instances. We can also trigger workflows based on the employees making changes. And there are 2 more examples you can see on the screen here, where we've got the address details change and the bank details change. Now, these are workflows that will trigger overnight. So each night we look in the early hours of the morning UK time to see who has made any changes to their address details or their bank details in the previous day. And we can then trigger a notification to go off to the right people to let them know that that has happened. And then our final type of continuous workflow is this workflow that's based on a trigger date. So we are looking actually at step number 1 in the workflow, saying when is that due, and we're going to trigger the workflow based on that. They've got examples for things like probation workflows, where actually you may set workflow step number 1 to be due X number of weeks after an employee's start date. Moving on to our third and final area of workflows, we have got our task workflows. So we've got workflows here that could be used within the recruitment module to assign tasks to people as part of that process. We've also got the onboarding and offboarding workflows that we can use whenever somebody joins or whenever somebody leaves the business. And then finally, we've got our task workflows. Now, these are workflows that are not related directly to any of the other options that we've seen earlier on. They could be workflows that you look to publish manually, or they could be workflows that are triggered off the back of a form being submitted, or they can be triggered within other workflows. Before we move on to the step types, I want to come into the system and just give you an idea of how that would look in practice. So here within the Moorepay HR screen, I'm going to Administration and then HR, followed by Workflows. Now here, I'm going to come into seeing a lot of the existing workflows that I've built that can either be in the active section or in a draft or retired status in the archived section. However, if I click on the Add button within this screen, we're going to come through and get this option to add our workflow. Now, once you've chosen that name, the category option is where you're going to see those 3 initial breakdowns. So we've got the approval, we've got the continuous, and then we've got the task. If I choose on continuous, for an example, we then get some additional options that appear on screen. Now, some of these we will be talking about later on in today's session. For now, the only one that I want to refer to is this type box, which then appears, which allows us to choose the kind of workflow that we want to happen. These do vary based on the category that we choose, but this is where you can see all of the types that are available. Once you've got your initial screen built up with all of your options, we then need to think about actually with a workflow, what kind of action, what kind of functionality do we want to automate within this workflow? These can be broken down into some broad areas. So our first set are all around actions. Now, this could be for an onboarding workflow, the option to create an account. This is going to go through and create that user account and send the login details to that employee. It could also be around using our mail merge letters in templates. It could be sending documents, it could be sending emails to people, or it could be requesting signatures for certain templates or documents within the system. Could also be looking at tasks. Now, tasks are things like on an approval workflow where we're going to require approval, where we might actually be sending a form out to somebody to complete, or we might be assigning a task for somebody to mark when they've completed it before the next step happens. We've also got some areas around tasks and checks. So we've got the option to send links to new starters. And we can see that on the screenshot here, where we've got the option for the employee to be directed straight towards an area where they can update their personal details, their bank details, their emergency contacts, or to go through and upload any documents that they might need to as part of their onboarding process. Now, there are two very distinct ways that people do tend to approach this. If you were to use the dedicated employee tasks here, you would have 4 independent steps within a workflow that would potentially trigger one after the other. Now, that's going to send 4 emails and assign 4 tasks to an employee, which is really good because you can see on a very granular basis where people might be with certain tasks. However, I do appreciate there are some concerns about overwhelming new starters with emails, and actually you might want to combine that within one task. And what we'd suggest with that is going back to the previous type of emails and actions that are available. We can actually put links within the create account email that will direct people towards the right part of the system, but you'll lose some of that granularity. And I'll show you an example of how that create account email could look in just a short moment. There are also some checks that are available that can just go through and mark as either incomplete or complete over certain key data. And also we can do things like send reports out to people. Now, these might be links that you want to send to people as a prompt, as a link on a regular basis. It is worth noting that that link will just direct people to the report within the system, and it doesn't send any kind of export or snapshot of the report. Our last sections we've got here around workflows and around recruitment. So here we might be triggering a workflow within another part of a workflow. And this is really good for sub-processes. So you might have DBS or security clearance processes that may not necessarily be applicable to every role, but you might want to incorporate that in. We can have that as a trigger workflow within a workflow. That's going to allow the main onboarding workflow to be quite succinct. And actually, we can just break out that small process into 3-4 steps outside of the main workflow. And finally, you can see on screen, we've got some examples of what you might use the recruitment tasks for, sending links to CVs or to the candidate's record, or to go through and automate the updating of a candidate's recruitment stage. In the system, these can take form of some different parts. And what I want to show you is for the onboarding workflow, how some of these tasks might play out. So in the search box, back under administration and then HR in workflows, I'm just searching for my onboarding workflow here. And by clicking on the actions button at the end, which does give us various options that are available should we want to view the status of some of these workflows, enable things, disable things. For now, I'm going to click on change workflow, which is going to bring us into the steps that are available in this workflow. The one that I want to bring your attention to in particular is step number 2. And this is the type of send account email. So for a new starter, just to reiterate, this is the step that is going to go through and create the account for the employee. It's also going to go through and give them their details to log in. However, that is on the proviso. In the message contents, you have included the tags for employee underscore login underscore name and also for employee underscore new underscore password. Now, if you are using SSO single sign-on to sign into your system, this may be a moot point, but for those of you that are using the traditional login name and password to sign in, without these details, the employee is going to get the email to let them know that their login details have been created, but they'll never actually get the ability to log in. As you can see within here then, we've included some hyperlinks, like I mentioned, around the areas of the system that you can direct people to. And if I take the personal details as an example here, what I've done within the system is hover over to self-service on the left-hand menu, clicked into my details, and then on the personal details tab, I've used the right-click button and selected the copy link. In the workflow email then, I can go through, highlight the text that I want to put the hyperlink against, and then at the menu bar at the top of this box, I've chosen the link icon. This is where I can then paste my copied link, select insert link, and that will create the scenarios we've got here where we've got the highlighted text that people can use within the email. Now, you might be seeing what we've got here and thinking, fantastic, I've got this great idea for a workflow, but actually, it's only going to apply to certain people within the business. Conveniently, this is where we come on to the general workflow restrictions that can be applied. Now, with this, we can go through and choose some different areas to be aware of. And one of the biggest parts is our metadata option. So this is where actually with a workflow, we can go through and decide actually it's only people within a given department, within a particular site or region. People with certain job statuses, business units, cost centers, headcount classifications, we can all differentiate within that main creation screen that we're using within the workflow module. We do also have a limit to say, actually, we only want this workflow to apply to people that have got a certain length of service that's available. However, there are also some options we'll come on to on the next slide where we talk about people who might be in probation or people who might be leaving or have left the business. And then finally, if we want this to only apply to manager roles, people who are managers, then we can go through and use the only manager role option. but it is worth noting that it will put that restriction in. So just make sure that you are right with that. You only want people where the job role is highlighted as yes for manager. There are also some workflow specific restrictions that we need to consider. So when it comes to approval, we can see under the under the screenshot here where we've got some time off approval workflows. We've actually got restrictions where we can go through and apply it to only certain time off types. Now, it is worth noting that when you are building any workflows like your own custom time off approval, when you do that, it switches off the default process. So you do need to make sure that actually we've got every scenario covered, not just the one-off edge case that we may have considered. But also with these, we get an option that's underneath, which is called Workflow Applies to Manager/Approver Actions. And this allows us to actually differentiate, say, I want workflow A to trigger if the request is submitted by the employee, whereas we might want workflow B to trigger if it's submitted by the manager. An example of this might be a training approval workflow. Actually, if this employee submits the training request, then we're going to follow one path. But actually, if the manager submits it, we're going to follow some different steps. And I'll show you some examples of what that drop down looks like when we look at the screen in a moment. But you'll be able to differentiate between it. When it comes to continuous workflows, we also have the option to only trigger once per day. Now, I would say for 99% of the cases of workflows that I look at, the only trigger once per day needs to be left as no. Where this really comes into its own is if you had a one-step workflow that was going to trigger every Monday morning and you wanted to send the manager a report. Step number one, sending a report to let the manager know of all of the birthdays that are coming up in the coming week for his staff. If we set only trigger once per day as no, and the manager had 5 birthdays that week, the manager is going to get 5 emails, all with that same report attached. So in that scenario, we'd want to set only trigger once per day as yes. However, if you were sending individual emails rather than a link to a report, you wanted to send an email each day it was somebody's birthday, we would trigger that only once per day as no. And that means the manager, if they've got 2 birthdays on one day, they would get an email for each birthday. Some other options to consider when it comes to some of the restrictions that we can apply. There is an option to trigger against employees in probation. And I'll show you again in a moment the permutations that we can have of that. But basically, we can trigger it only for the people who are out of probation, only for the people who are in probation, or actually we trigger it for everyone regardless of their probation date. And then one final restriction option consideration when it comes to the workflows is the all comments visible box. Now, this is relevant for where we've got steps where people can add comments. Now, commonly these tend to be things like yes, no's, require approvals, and assign tos. I'm going to take the example of a time off request workflow where the employee makes the initial request. Step number 1 sends it to the manager for approval. Step number 2 sends it to the head of department. Step number 3 sends it to HR. Now, all 3 of those people can go through and add comments, and with all comments visible set to no, that means that the head of department won't see the manager's comments instantly, and vice versa, that HR wouldn't see the head of department or the manager's comments straight away when they click on the link. If it was set to yes, it would mean that the head of department, when they're clicking on their approval link, would see the employee's comments, and when HR or admin click on the link, they would see on the same screen the manager comments and the head of department comments. It is worth noting that for HR and admin level users, there are other ways that you can still access the comments that have been made, even with the all comments visible as no. To take you into the system and give you an idea of how this looks in the front of the system, when I click on the add button, and in this scenario I'll choose the approval and training, you can see here now that we've got some of the different options that are available. So first and foremost, we've got this manager approval. So here we can say, no, we only want it to trigger when an employee adds it, or we only want it to trigger when it's a manager adding it on behalf of an employee, or actually we can go through and say, yes, we want it to trigger if an employee adds it, or if a manager adds it. Similarly, in the probation, we've got these three options. So by selecting no against triggering employees in probation, we're only going to get people who are out of probation. The middle option is actually going to give us people who are both in and out of probation. And the final option is where we can go through and actually say we want it just to trigger for those people who are in probation only. Coming further down on the screen then, we've got the options where we can come through and choose any permutation that we want of any of the options that we see here. We can go through and we can select all departments, for example, but we might say actually we only want it for all sites where all departments where the site is equal to Foxfield Park. Now, it is worth noting that in example number 1, in the departments, if we were to add a new department, that would automatically be captured by this workflow. But as we've not chosen all sites, if we have got another site that comes on board that also needs this process, we will need to come back into the edit screen to be able to add them back in. We can then come through and tick the rest of the options within here. Same rules apply as the examples I've given earlier. We then come to the final 3 options where we can choose length of service if it's applicable. We can choose whether it's applicable to managers only. And then finally, we can choose whether it sits in the active or the archived section. Now, where you are going through and building something, especially something that might be involved in approval actions or continuous actions, I would suggest until you're ready to actually start using that workflow, that you leave this active as no. And that's going to prevent workflows from triggering prematurely and leaving things unable to be fully approved. That will leave those workflows in this side of the system, in the archived. Once you are ready to make something live, we can click on the Actions button and then select the Set Active option. So now you've got your workflows together, you've got your ideas, you know where you might be heading. We've got different things to consider. Like I mentioned earlier on, where you are building a custom workflow that is replacing one of the default processes, We want to make sure that you are covering all of those eventualities, so nothing's actually slipping through the net and stuck either automatically being approved or being stuck at pending, unable to be approved. There are warning icons that will appear if there is a problem with your workflow. You can click on these to get more information. Where you are looking at that approval, making sure that that is a solid process that's following through, making sure that you're happy with that, and whether actually it needs to be an approval or whether you are just sending notification out. Now, when it comes to actually thinking about your workflows, before you even get to clicking on administration, HR and workflows, it's really important to have a clear idea in your head of what you are doing and when it is happening. Now, there are some dedicated tools that you can use, but ultimately, never underestimate the value of a flowchart. Now, this could be something like Visio if you've got a license, Draw.io, which is a free web tool, or if you're in an office, never underestimate the value of flip chart paper and post-it notes, because that's going to allow you to write in English what you want to happen, when it needs to happen, and who needs to action it. And you can actually get an idea by moving those post-its around as to where you want things to happen. Now, we do also have some reference material that's available within the system, and it's in our knowledge base. So from your HR screen, those of you with admin HR level access, you'll be able to click on the question mark that's in the top right hand corner of the screen. That will bring you up our help and support box. If I was to then click on knowledge base, that'll bring us through to the knowledge base that's available. And then on the four options beneath, clicking knowledge base again will bring you through to some of our articles. The last option on the left hand side, which has got the useful how-tos, clicking on that brings you through to this screen. And we have some different areas of guides, how-tos that you can use. And the three that I want to highlight to you are the ones which are headed form recipes, report recipes, and most relevant in this case, workflow recipes. Now, these are a common selection of reports, forms, and workflows that commonly get asked about, that get seen within the system, that we've actually created step-by-step guides for to help you on your way. If we take the onboarding workflow as an example, I can click on onboarding workflow recipe here. And we can then see by scrolling through on the screen, these step-by-step guidance of everything you need to fill in. First of all, on the edit screen, and then within the step screen for each step as to what you might want to make. Now, you can see that we've got things like suggested message content with the tags that you might want to use, but you can always change the wording when you're making this yourself. But it's just some ideas and guidance of how to go about these things. We cover things such as onboarding, offboarding, approval workflows, and continuous style workflows that you might want to build. Finally, we end up at the scenario where you've got your workflow built, you're happy with it, you've tested it, and now actually you want to double check something may not be working as you expect. First things first, we can never underestimate that value of testing. either by using dedicated test users or by using the restrictions to make sure that you are limited to that workflow only triggering for a certain department. But really, the two main areas that can cause headaches when it comes to troubleshooting is things where a task, something might get added by HR or an admin level user. So if we look at an approval workflow, for example, the approval time off workflow won't trigger if the time off is added by the HR admin level user, because actually due to their level of access in the system, we assume them to have the overall permission for adding this, so we bypass that approval process. And the other things to consider is when you are testing the workflow, is actually making sure that you've got no permissions which are actually preventing the workflow from triggering. You may have listed it to one department as an example, and you're expecting it to trigger for Daniel Parker as an example in my system. When you go and view Daniel Parker's record, you may actually find that he's in the IT department, and the reason that he's not received that workflow is actually because you've limited it to just the HR team. And with that, that brings us to the end of all of the content for today's session. I'll just give this some time now to see if there's any questions that are going to come through. I hope that's given you some ideas, some inspiration and thoughts as to what you might want to be using workflows for in your own system. If there is anything that you come away from this that you are unsure of, or after you've built something, if you do need something clarifying, please don't forget the support team are there to help you with this. Just whilst we're giving a few more moments for any other questions to come through, just remains for me to thank you for your time today. If you have got any questions, for those of you that are in support, please reach out to the support desk, the customer success team, the knowledge base information that's available for you. For those of you who might be in implementation, your project manager or consultant will be your best port of call for guidance. Dates for your diary. Our next masterclass is on the 28th of November, and it begins that time of the year where we start looking at the end of year process. So just having a little look at a question that has come through, and this is going to be relating to expense claims, and the question revolves around sending attached receipts to an external user via a workflow. I'm afraid, unfortunately, for those kind of things where that data is actually held within the system, we can't send that externally, I'm afraid. Glad that helped, and you're very welcome. Our next webinar, it's slightly later in the month. It's about a week or so later than we normally do, but we will be running 2 sessions 1 week after the other. We've got one in November, one in December, where we're going to start looking at the end of year process. You'll have the choice of which one you want to attend, and we'll go through that process from start to finish. You don't need to attend both, however, but I would encourage you to sign up to at least one or the other, as you will get a copy of the recording off the back of it, and that can prove invaluable for your end of year processes. I think that's it for everything filtering through, so it just remains for me to wish you a good rest of your week and rest of the month, and I'll speak to you all again